Hello everyone, my name is Fern and it is my pleasure today to welcome you to our webinar focused on using Collector for ArcGIS as part of your wildland fire workflows. This is the first in the Esri Wildland Fire webinar series. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted in the next few days. As a participant, you will receive a link in the recording in the follow-up email. We would like to encourage you to enter questions in the GoToWebinar questions dialog box as we go along during the presentation today. We will answer as many of those questions as time permits. If we don't get to your question, we will follow up via email after the webinar. Also, there will be a short survey that pops up on your screen when the webinar ends. We would greatly appreciate your feedback and will use your suggestions when designing future webinars. To start out, we'd like to kick it off with a poll. We'd like to know what responsibility or role you have related to wildfire. So really, what position do you fill or see yourself filling when using Collector on fire? Are you GISS, or are you providing GIS support? Are you in operations? Are you public information? Are you a manager such as command and general staff? Go ahead and fill this out. We'll give you another couple seconds. And then let's close the poll and read the results. It looks like the majority of you are GIS, and second up would be operations and then others. So who are we? As I mentioned earlier, I'm Fern, or Chris Ferner. I'm Esri's Wildland Fire Specialist, and next week actually marks my 5th year here at Esri. Before coming here, I worked for a number of agencies in the fields of fire ecology, forestry, emergency response. And part of those positions, I spent many summers and falls working on fires of kind of all management levels as the GISS, as well as assisting with prescribed burns. I do continue to maintain my GISS qualifications by going on at least one assignment a year, and I have a few other task books that I work on during prescribed burn events. I live in southern Wyoming and spend as much of my summer as fire season allows at my rustic cabin felling trees and building burn piles. Today, I'm very thrilled to be joined by my Esri colleague, Doug Morgenthaler. Doug is the product owner of Collector for ArcGIS. He has a lot of experience supporting agencies using Collector during incidents. Among those, he's helped CAL FIRE develop and implement their workflow for conducting damage assessment following high structure loss incidents. So he's joining us from near Esri headquarters, which are down in Southern California. At the start of a fire, there may not be any maps. I've seen fire maps drawn on sides of trucks and on cardboard. But as a fire grows in size, typically you'll get some GIS support, and you may end up with a briefing board with a nice briefing map stapled to it, maps to take out into the field in the form of map books. And when we think about edits and what information goes onto those maps, typically that's being passed along by GPS, by hand-drawn edits to the map, or often now using Collector. When I think about GIS on a fire, this is often the site I envision, except for it's typically much more crowded than this particular yurt. So usually you'll have anywhere from 1 to many GIS specialists, as well as any number of operations staff coming and going, asking for maps, picking up the maps to take to their crews, putting in map requests for the next day, or maybe providing inputs or edits to the data that's being displayed on those maps. Given the pandemic, I wanted to start the webinar series focused on Collector because it can so easily send up-to-date edits both to and from operations staff who are working in the field without needing to walk into a more crowded or populated area. And depending on the situation, GISSs might be asked to support those who are working with Collector remotely. And so some of these best practices and tips and tricks that we'll be sharing today are going to be really helpful for those workflows. So let's take a quick look at the agenda before we get started. we're going to start with kind of what is Collector, where does it fit in, how to prepare to go into the field, and Doug is going to help us see how to deploy that map into the field, then how to use the app to conduct field data collection. We'll wrap up with what's next, what's coming in Collector, what questions and answers we have time to address during the webinar. We will do so, and then we'll have a few follow-up things at the very end. Before I hand it off to Doug, I have one more poll question. We'd like to get a little bit of understanding on your experience using Collector for ArcGIS. So have you maybe never used it? Are you somewhat familiar? You've used it on a few incidents. You feel very familiar, you know how to troubleshoot and get through any potential problems with setting it up or signing in, syncing, going offline. Are you an expert where you feel confident in supporting and using Collector? So let's close that poll and take a look at the results. About half of you are somewhat familiar. So, and then the next closest is not familiar at all. And we even have a few experts on the line. All right, well, thank you very much. And now I'm going to hand it over to Doug. Doug, would you like to take it from here?
Thanks, Vern. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Collector. So at a high level, Collector is designed for efficient, accurate data collection. Works anywhere, anytime. Obviously, on many incidents, cell coverage is spotty at best or non-existent. Collector is designed to work well in both connected, occasionally connected, and disconnected environments. And then in cases where you do need to capture information with a higher degree of accuracy, you can use a GNSS receiver to do that. And it is available on a number of platforms. So let's talk about Collector in the scope of a broader field operations workflow. So when you think about going out to the field, there's not just the field work itself, there's other activities that are around supporting and then collecting and aggregating and sharing that data. So there's planning that goes on. There's you may have to need to get to the place where you need to do your work. Obviously, getting a chance to do the capture side, which is why one main reason you're here. Collector plays a big part there. But then also back at the ICP, you're monitoring what's going on so that changes can be made to plans or as conditions evolve. So Collector is one of a number of apps that are designed to support this broader workflow. Today, we're just focusing on Collector, but I think it's important for everyone to understand that there are other apps that are designed for your mobile workforce to be able to do some of these other activities as well. Okay, so let's talk about how you get started in preparing to go out into the field. So again, this is typically done in the office. The best case scenario is this is done before the incident even starts, some of these things. Okay, so Collector is a configurable app. So what does that mean? That means it comes to life and presents the information that is in a web map. Collector is founded on the concept of a web map. So a web map can contain multiple things. It can contain feature layers. Operational layers might be things showing your hotspots, your ICP, your drop points, etc. But also your base map. Obviously, that might be your topographic map, might be imagery, depending on your need. So a web map contains a series of feature layers. Those feature layers, once you have that web map is what you use in ArcGIS. And that's how you can configure Collector, by providing different capabilities through the feature layer and the web map to drive the workflow in Collector itself. So again, here's a few examples of things that you can control. You can control how the symbology is. Obviously, for this group, there's a very well-known symbology that folks use in Wildfire, but also things like what sort of editing capabilities do they have? Do they have the ability to take maps offline, etc.? So if we look at the feature layer itself, remember feature layers are part of your web map. So again, those are places you can configure editing capabilities. So in some cases, you may only want people to do inspect information that's already been collected. You only want them to update the attributes. You don't want them to change the location of that information. Also things like whether or not the editor tracking information, so you can record who made those edits in the field. And again, a lot of this can be done ahead of time, just by when you're authoring your feature layer. Now on the web map, there are a couple things that make a web map a collector map. So it has to have at least one feature layer that supports editing. And it also obviously has to have a base map. So once you have those capabilities, then there are a few things that you can augment to make the workflow easier when you get out into the field, but also getting out into the field. So things like setting up a search. So if I wanted to search on a particular type of information, so maybe it's a draw point, could be a road, geocoded address. I can set those things up ahead of time in my web map. So because for this job, most cases you're going to want to prepare for working offline. So there are some additional things that you need to be aware of when you're authoring your feature layers in order to take them offline. So again, they must have, the map must be editable. You can include data that is not editable in your offline map. So that could be reference data, could be parcels, could be forest boundaries, those things that are important for context, but aren't necessarily editable. And then you need to have what we call global IDs. And that basically allows us to uniquely identify every edit as it comes in so that we can maintain that synchronization between edits that are made in the field for multiple users. And then finally, if you have a base map that uses tiles, either raster or vector tiles, it must support the export capability. The export capability is what allows us to pick up and extract a portion of that base map down to the device. And then again, you must also enable the web map for offline use. So that again, that's just a switch there in the web map settings. So when we talk about offline workflows, there's really two main workflows. So the first is an on-demand workflow where somebody goes and defines the area that they want to take offline. The person that's going out in the field, they have to make some decisions, and then they go and download that area. And that's traditionally been the way Collector has worked for many years in terms of its offline support. But there's now a new way to do that too, and it's called predefined map areas. So again, thinking about where we are, we're thinking about the preparation side. This is a really important area where you can really simplify people's work. And that's by defining that as part of the web map so that the user just selects the area to work offline, simplifies the amount of decisions that they need to make. We'll get into a little bit more detail here in a minute. All right, so authoring base maps. So there are many ways to many reasons to have multiple base maps. Maybe you want an imagery and a topographic base map because you may need context in one of those cases. But when you get in really tight, maybe you need to look at the imagery to understand a little bit more about what you're seeing. Obviously, when you think about base maps by far are the biggest portion of any offline download to Collector. So more detail is a larger download. There are some newer style type space maps for things like topographic that's called vector tile base maps. These are much smaller and very high performant. So these are not available for things like imagery because those are rasters. But when possible, if you're using a street space map or something like that for context, consider the use of a vector tile base map. The other thing is that you can prepare these base maps ahead of time, either before the instance starts for your area of responsibility, maybe that's for your forest, or before you deploy folks to the field. So, and that can be done a few different ways. You can do that in ArcGIS Pro or a standalone app called Tile Package Creator. Or this is something, if you are someone who's familiar with Python, there are a number of scripts that you can do to create and generate these base maps directly. And again, the advantage of doing this is, one, you can have multiple base maps on the device, but also that's going to simplify the download and really streamline that process when we get to the deployment side. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about our predefined map areas. So again, these are relatively new. This is something that we've introduced in the last couple of years. So this really, again, simplifies the offline process for both the GIS admin and the field worker, because the GIS admin knows exactly where they want, the GIS knows where they want that person to go. The field worker may or may not, they may not be familiar with the area. They also have to make some decisions about the level of detail. Those are all sources of error, potentially frustration. By using predefined areas, you can define all of that ahead of time. Secondly, you can define rectangular areas. They're not always square. Or in some cases, you can use an irregular polygon. We know that most wildfire boundaries are not rectangular, so being able to kind of scope that down will help minimize the download size there. So let's take a look here at how you can create a predefined area. So here I'm in a web map, and I'm going to settings, and I'm going to go to the offline settings, and you'll see there's this manage areas button. I'll tap on that, and now it's going to give me a series, a map, and I can create a new map area. I can give it a name. So again, something that's easy for people to understand, well-defined. So in this case, I'll name it Ojai. I can also define the level of detail that I want. So if I can make that all the way down to building level, and then I can save that, and then that's going to, and then finally, of course, I'll define the area for that pre-planned offline map area. So in this case, I'm using a rectangular case. And now that's packaging up. So once that's done packaging, again, all done in the office, but very easy for somebody to go down that. We'll talk about that a little bit when we get to the deployment section. So sideloading base maps. We talked a little bit about authoring base maps. Why would you go to the time and trouble of authoring a base map? Well, authoring a base map is one way where you can really speed up deployment when people need to get out into the field on an incident. So there are a couple of reasons for that. One, typically, again, the base map is by far the largest portion of downloading a map to take offline. And when you're doing that, you're also consuming things that like bandwidth. So if you're in camp, that could really be very, very costly when you have lots of people trying to get out in the morning after the briefing. Again, and then there's other ways to think about how do you share those. But before you start working with sideloaded base maps in the field as part of the deployment, you need to do some authoring steps. And we'll take a quick look at this video here that outlines those steps. Again, we're still back in our web map here. We're going to go back to our offline settings, and we're going to click on this advanced options button. And down here at the bottom, says use a tile package for the offline base map. And I'm going to paste in a name of the TPK that I'm going to sideload onto that device that should be used for this map. So that's it for someone to define, okay, for this web map, I want you to use this sideloaded base map. So when we go to download that, we're going to look for that. And there's many ways to get these base maps out onto the device. Many of you may be familiar with some of those already, but we'll talk a little bit about maybe some new ways that you aren't familiar with to this point. All right, and then the last thing, of course, once in terms of the preparation side, is sharing your map. Of course, you need to share your map with those who are going to be using it. Again, that's using things like groups in ArcGIS Online or in ArcGIS Enterprise. One important thing to note, something that does trip people up, is that you have to share that map to a group. Collector does not look for maps that are shared to the whole organization, so you need to make sure that that map is shared to a group that that person who's going to be going out in the field is a member of. Another opportunity to streamline your workflows is doing some work ahead of time to limit the number of maps that people see when they're in the field. Oftentimes they may have had maps from previous incidents, previous revision or versions of that map, and you don't want them to continue using that. So you can go and exclude certain maps. So here, if we take a look at this brief video, again, we're in our web map, in our settings, and down at the bottom, there's a property called Use in Collector for ArcGIS. So by unchecking this and saving the web map, that map will not show up on the mobile device. So again, this is, you may have maps that are editable. Again, they meet that collector criteria, but they don't meet, they're not intended to be used in the field. So this is one way where you could exclude those from collector. So again, just an opportunity to minimize some confusion when people are getting ready to get deployed into the field. All right, so we've talked a little bit about preparation. Now let's talk a little bit about deploying your map to Collector for getting out in the field. So the first thing is you can do things like using QR codes to simplify your deployment. There's a number of ways that you can use QR codes. They're basically all just an easy way to use your device's camera to scan one of these and execute an action. There's a couple of ways that you can do this. One is you can embed this a link that actually says which map do I want you to open. So again, taking some of the opportunities for confusion or misinformation, you can go through and just say, hey, tap this link. You can text them, or again, you could put it up on a QR code. The other thing is if you are using a ArcGIS Enterprise, sometimes one of the challenges is just signing in. So if you may have to enter your portal URL, or if you're using enterprise logins on ArcGIS Online, you may have to enter information that you may not be that familiar with. You can also create one of those QR codes for that as well. And if you tap the sign in with ArcGIS Enterprise button, there's an option to scan the code and it'll pre-fill all of that information for the end user. So again, just another way to simplify and take some of the burden of getting people out into the field. The other thing too is there's ways that you can help them without, obviously the best case is when you've got enough information to work independently. So the administrators can create a document. We have a predefined template outlining most of the common workflows and some of the troubleshooting steps that's basically designed to be printed on two sides of an 8.5 by 11 sheet. You can fold it up, stuff it in your pocket, and if you run into problems, those are things that you have at your fingertips, just to help work through a challenge that you may have in the field. So again, we make that available in our help, and that's something that we certainly encourage you to take advantage of and configure to your needs. Okay, so we talked a little bit about sideloading Basemaps in the preparation side. So let's talk about how you will do that when you're working offline. So how do I get that to the device? So traditionally, if you're using iOS, you would have had to use iTunes, which required a physical connection to a device. That device had to have iTunes installed. It's definitely was not the easiest way to do, especially for a lot of people. early, early in the morning, all trying to get out in the office, really it can be a challenge. So in a couple of years ago, iOS was released with a new app called the Files app. And the Files app basically allows you to support sharing of base maps. So you could put a base map up on Google, on iCloud or on Box or any cloud sharing service, and they can download that through the Files app directly. So no connection necessary. You can do that. You don't even have to be in the tent. You could be somewhere else in camp, or even on your way to an incident. You could sideload that base map. So we'll take a quick look at this video here that'll show how you can do that with the Files app. So again, we're just browsing for a base map that's on iCloud Drive in this case. And we're going to go and we're going to move that. And onto our device, we're going to click on my iPhone and go into Collector and then drop it in that location and hit the copy button at the top. And now that is available to Collector to use either in the Basemap tool or when I'm downloading a basemap that's been defined to have a sideloaded basemap. The other thing that's great about iOS is that you can support sharing peer-to-peer. So if you've got a few people, obviously in the area of COVID-19, this is not too close, but you can actually do peer-to-peer sharing. So one person can download it and many people, they can share that with many people via AirDrop. So they may have other people on their team that they want to deploy that to. And again, minimizing the amount of Wi-Fi bandwidth that's required or cellular bandwidth. And AirDrop is very fast, handles large files quite well. On Android, you can also use an SD card if your device is equipped with that. So again, you can put a basemap, tile package, or the like onto that device and make that available. You can just pop it right into your drive. You can have a stack of them as people are coming in and get ready to go out into the field that morning. Okay, so again, so this is sort of, we took a look at the act of how do I sideload that base map. Now let's talk about how does that work when we go to download a map. All right, so we're going to just show this video here, and this is taking an offline area, and you'll notice that this base map uses that FS Topo TPK that we had sideloaded previously and had defined in our web map. So again, also minimizes some of the decision. Now this was a on-demand workflow, the one that we've supported for a number of years. But the size of this download, when you see this one finished, look at the size of that, 3.4 megabytes. For a pretty decent size area. Your base map is many times that. So by using that sideloaded base map, you can really streamline getting folks out into the field. One thing to note on this, if for some reason the base map, you can't access the base map, it didn't get loaded onto the device, you don't have it, you can still download that map just fine. You'll just have to download, it'll ask you if you want to download the base map as well. So it'll download the operational layers as well as the base map. So you're not stuck if for some reason that sideloaded tile package is not there. All right, so again, a couple of things here. Let's talk about how does someone get that map area downloaded. We took a quick look at that in the last slide there, in the last example. So this is where you're working with predefined map areas. So if you remember, we went through and defined a couple of map areas there for people to download. So the best thing about this is it really simplifies the story, and we'll just take a look at this video to highlight that. So for this Thomas Fire web map, you can see that I've got two offline areas, and all I had to do was figure out which one I needed to work on. If I'm supposed to be working in Ventura, I just go ahead and tap that and download it. It's like downloading your latest Netflix show. Again, so very easy. Now, just because you may define predefined map areas for your field workforce, that does not mean that you're limited to that. If you tap on the 3 dots up at the top in the menu, you can go through and add the offline area as you're used to in Collector today and in previous generations as well. All right, well, that's a quick look at preparation and deployment.
So Doug, I want to chime in here because I already want to like rewind and rewatch some of the things you mentioned. I think they're very helpful when working on an incident, and especially with the first section of preparing the maps and data correctly ahead of time. I think the more, I know from my personal experience in doing this for both fires as well as other types of disasters, that the more you do this ahead of time, then the less work that has to be done the day of. And you know, people may think, well, it's the same amount of work, you're just doing it ahead of time. But if I wait and do my data and map preparation during the incident, generally I'm multitasking, I'm busy, I'm doing something else, I'm distracted by all the people coming and going, and I'm going to make more mistakes, especially with sharing. I think that's one of the things that I see as an issue more than some other things, where make sure that not only you've tested a map that you've made, but that someone else has tested it. Because while you may think you've shared it into the correct group, sometimes not all the pieces are there. So the map and the data have to be shared into that group. So something to keep in mind. And then I also, the side loading base maps, I think, is so critical for space and storage management. So many devices don't have the maximum amount of space and storage, or if they do, maybe they've got photos or videos already saved on them or other apps. So trying to kind of optimize the way that the device is set up. And there are numerous ways to go about doing offline maps. For all of those GIS folks who are on the call, I recommend, you know, testing them all, practicing with them all, because on each incident something may work better with one kind of way to get the base maps to folks versus another. And I agree with COVID-19 now, maybe, you know, some of those distant ones, rather than having folks come in and plug in their device to side load, are going to be a little bit better. But thank you for all that.
Great points, Fern. I think the side loading of base maps is definitely one of those optimizations that not enough people take advantage of, I think, but given the large area sometimes, you know, side loaded base maps really can be a huge saver.
They can, and we have a lot of questions coming in. I just want to remind folks to keep entering those questions. I'll keep trying to get to them, and if we don't answer them during this call, we will follow up via email. So onward with data collection.
All right, so we've done our prep and we've been doing our deployment. Now we get to the work of actually collecting the information and getting it back to the decision makers and the incident team. So I wanted to highlight a few key capabilities that have come in to Collector over the past year or two. A year and a half or so for iOS, more recently for Android. So these are very valuable for if you're either an iOS or an Android user. So the first thing is advanced symbology. So, you know, getting the information that makes sense to you as a, you know, in Wildfire is very important. Things like labels. And vector-based maps. So let's just take a look at this video, and this will highlight some of those new capabilities in the map. So you'll see a few things. Of course, you'll see the hatch mark, and then obviously you've got your dozer lines there and drop points. Those drop points are labeled. so I don't have to tap on it to find out which drop point that is. I can also do things like rotate the map. So because I'm using vector base maps, in this case, my labels rotate. As well as, I can orient that map to what makes sense to me as I'm out in the field. And then finally, and I'll talk about this in a bit more, ArcGIS Arcade support is something that's, if you're not familiar with it, it's very powerful. And we'll take a look at an example here about how you can leverage this in your work here in a minute. So we talked about the map improvements, so things like labels, things like better symbology, but there's also a number of things that we did recently to really improve how you work with the app. We know that many of you are not, didn't say you were experts, so this is something we really did based to try and simplify the workflow for people who aren't necessarily familiar with Collector but still need to be effective. So things like the improved collect experience. In general, trying to be able to work between the form and the map. Oftentimes you kind of have to balance those two. And then other things like units and compass navigation. So let's take a look at this video that just highlights a few of these capabilities. So the first thing you'll see is that there's a big plus button at the bottom. It's easy to find when you're doing collection. And then in addition, of course, you've got the great symbology here. Also, in this case, obviously, we're showing a portrait mode device, but or a phone. But if you are on a tablet, on an iPad, if you flip that up and hold that like you would a book, that will be something that it orients and you get the same experience. So you can, if you want to look at a lot of information on the form, you can scroll that up and look at the whole form, or push it down and really look at the whole map. So here I'm dropping a pin on the map to capture a hotspot. So a couple things. Obviously, I'm moving between that map and the form very easily just by sliding it up and down. So I don't have to. I can have all form, all map, or a combination of both. A couple of things you'll notice. Of course, there was a label there that was added. We talked a little bit in the preparation side about search. So if I wanted, in this map, we configured search to search for things like drop points. So if I type in DP12, I can quickly get to DP12. And then if I scroll up, I can use things like compass. So if I didn't need to do straight line navigation to get to that drop point, I can do that, and you can see that the map is rotating as I do so. So in much the way you would use a traditional compass. But it's also giving you distance to that particular location. So just a few things there to highlight some new improvements that hopefully help streamline those workflows while you're out in the field. All right, talking about Arcade. So we talked a little bit about Arcade from the standpoint of, hey, this is a great thing, but what can it do for me? So there's a few things. If you've seen any of the smart mapping work that's been going on in ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS in general, a lot of that is driven by Arcade expressions, but typically where you're going to use it in Collector is in the pop-ups or in the labels. So it is a very powerful cross-platform language that you can use on your desktop, in ArcGIS Pro, or in a web application, or in the field in apps like Collector. So this workflow is just a very simple one, taking weather measurements. So if you're out, using your sling psychometer and you need to enter a dry bulb and wet bulb temperature, rather than going to the chart to determine what that is, all I need to do is enter my two values for my dry and wet bulb temperatures, submit that, and you'll see that it automatically calculates the relative humidity, the heat index, etc. So not only do I have that, but when that information is available, obviously that can go back up to the incident command team so that they can have a better situational awareness there. So there's a number of examples that we publish. There's a blog post on this one specifically that we'll send out after the seminar. All right, so one thing that of course, is important in wildfire is being able to communicate effectively about coordinates and things like areas. So in this video, we'll take a quick look at how you can configure Collector to show various types of units for coordinates. In this case, we'll set up our coordinates to be degrees, decimal, minutes. And we'll set our area to always represent and be shown in acres. So now once we go into the fire and we tap on a drop point, you'll see that underneath there, you're seeing the degrees, decimal, minutes readout. And if we tap on the fire perimeter, we'll see that that is in acres. That was obviously a very large fire. But again, just some very simple things that you can configure in Collector to make understanding what's going on, but also communicate that information more effectively to others. All right, so we talked about this quite a fair bit already, but let's talk a little bit about the workflow when you don't have a predefined area. There are a number of enhancements here that you can make. One is that you can turn on or off layers. So you may have layers that are not on by default, but provide a lot of context to find the right area. You can also use bookmarks. So as the map author, you could set a bookmark to help people orient themselves. Not as good as a pre-planned area. You can also set the level of detail. So level of detail obviously is very important. So things like buildings probably provide a good sense of scale for people, especially on imagery. And then of course, once that's defined, you can just tap download and that's downloading. You can download more than one map area. So if you may be deployed in a few different areas, you may download 3 or 4 different a mix of predefined areas. You may also download an on-demand area. You can certainly mix and match those as well, but you're certainly not limited to one. Obviously, one of the important requirements is to be able to capture things like lines or polygons. Maybe that's a proposed dozer line or the like. So there's 2 methods of doing that. One is defining individual points as you walk along, and tap with the GPS, tap each location when you want to add a location, or more commonly for this industry probably is to stream those as you walk. There's 2 methods for streaming. Time and distance. Distance is the default. You can, of course, use those methods interchangeably. You can also use streaming as well as defining individual points interchangeably as well. So here we'll just take a quick look where I'm going to capture a planned secondary line. And as I walk, I can hit start streaming by tapping on that menu there, and then see my button change to a stop streaming. So now if I start walking, you'll see that those points are starting to get dropped for me automatically. And then when I'm done streaming, I can just hit the stop streaming button to stop that. And then I could always restart or enter my attributes in my form and submit my edit. There are some new capabilities that are coming to Collector. In these next couple of options are currently available on iOS only, but they will be coming to Android very soon. One is just trying to minimize the time you spend filling in a form. So oftentimes you may have to enter in a team or your name as an individual into the form. Well, those are things that obviously are repetitive, and we've tried to do some work to improve editing those repetitive entries. So here we'll just take a look at this video where I'm just going to edit this particular building and change its inspection. So I'll change its condition. But when I get to my inspection team, you'll see there was a recent values there above my keyboard, and I can use any recent value that I put for that particular field. Again, same here, partial roof collapse. Hopefully that's not something people see often, but if you are entering that repetitively, it does remember those automatically for you. You don't have to use them, but they're there for you to take advantage of. And that does work for both text fields or numbers, but also for coded value domains or pick lists of values as well. If you have a long list, it'll remember and just show you the top 3 at the top. In terms of other capabilities, sometimes you're may need to update a series of features for their attributes. Rather than doing one at a time, we now support the ability to go in and define a series of features that you want to update. In this case, we're doing some buildings. So by tapping the menu on the upper right, I can select Edit Multiple, select a number of buildings in this case that I want to inspect because they all should have the same value. I can also remove those if I accidentally selected one that I wasn't interested in. And once I'm satisfied with the features I've selected, the buildings here, I can hit Continue. And then I can go in and enter the values that I want to apply to all of those buildings. So in this case, minor and the condition and the date that those were inspected. And once I submit those, you'll see that those values are reflected on not just one of those buildings, but all of those that I had selected. So again, just some optimizations if you're inspecting or updating existing assets that you need to update. So many of you may or may not be familiar with one of our newest apps called Tracker for ArcGIS. Tracker for ArcGIS allows you to maintain, it's a very simple app, but it's really designed to track your location and information about your location. It can be done on a schedule. There's a whole lot of information available about that. But the reason why I wanted to highlight that here is that is a way for you to, if you're doing damage assessments, you're going through an urban area, certainly those areas, if you're not familiar with them especially, can look the same. So which streets have I traversed? This is a way for you to visualize where you've been. So in this example, we're just going to take a look at turning on those tracker tracks. This is because Tracker is installed. I have access to this. And now you can see that I can visualize the direction and where I've been in this area. So I can see that I may not have visited that cul-de-sac yet. So a good way to understand where you've gone. I know for some of the damage inspection workflows we've seen with groups like CAL FIRE, they do need to walk around each structure as part of the inspection. So this is a way to verify and validate that. All right, syncing edits. So obviously when we're working offline, we need to get those edits back to others in the organization, back to ArcGIS Online, for example. And we need to be able to get that information back down if the other changes have happened in our area. So in this case, we've made some number of improvements. You used to have to go to the maps list to sync your data. But now you can sync those edits directly within the map. So in this case, we're just going to quickly do a series of edits. And once we submit those, up in the toolbar, you'll notice there's an icon with an up and down arrow, and it's got a dot on it that indicates that we have edits that haven't been synced. You can turn on autosync. Autosync is going to try to sync every 15 minutes by default, but you can always sync, as we are here, by just tapping quickly on the sync button. So you don't have to kind of leave the map to go send data back to the office if you happen to be getting connectivity as you're driving back from the incident. Back to the ICP, you can just have autosync on, and if it gets connectivity, it will send it. If not, it will try again in 15 minutes. Troubleshooting. So best laid plans never quite work as well as one would hope. So within the sync panel and in general, so many of the errors we see are in things around download and sync. When you're taking that map offline or you're syncing, and a lot of that has to do with connectivity or access to the services or layers, and sometimes you get spotty connectivity, you get a little bit, but it's not enough to send out data. So by turning on troubleshooting within the settings of the app, you can log those settings and then just tap on the share icon here and send that via text, could send it via email, whatever your preferred delivery medium is, back to someone maybe in the office that can help diagnose that or provide some guidance. And if you are someone who uses Python, there are a number of ways that you can use Python to streamline all of these workflows, from the preparation side of building base maps for side loading. You can also create predefined map areas using our Python API. But you can also do things, as this particular example shows, is just being able to exclude a set of maps from Collector. So very easy to do that. We do have some examples out for that, but if you are someone who's familiar with Python, this is a great way to streamline some of those common workflows and save you a little bit of time. Okay, so that's kind of wrapping up the field data collection side. Obviously, some new improvements in Collector that we think will make this a lot more efficient and a lot more intuitive as you move into this fire season and beyond. So what's next for Collector? So there's a couple of things. Obviously, we talked a lot about the preparation side of getting a web map ready for and deploying it to Collector. We're building a new web app that'll be part of ArcGIS Online, and that's really thinking about that as a companion to our mobile app. So a lot of those things that you did and you searched around in the feature layer to configure or the web map settings to configure are now all being aggregated here into this app to help you simplify and streamline that deployment, all in sort of a one-stop shop in terms of that. It's really designed to simplify those of you who are supporting getting people out into the field, but also providing a platform for us to really get some of the things that people have been asking us for quite some time, like smart forms. So what are smart forms? Smart forms really, in our mind, are things that allow you to configure the map based on what information that you're entering. So things like conditional visibility. If the building is damaged, maybe you need to enter some information about the level of damage. But if it's not damaged, then that question isn't something that you would want to fill in on the form. Similarly, things about field grouping. Sometimes you may have a large number of fields that being able to work on a mobile device, which isn't that big, being able to sort of expand and collapse those groups while you're working with that data is also important. And then things like input types. We do support things like barcode scanning now already, but being able to define those for individual fields is something that we're also working on. So that's a wrap up on what's coming. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Fern.
Thank you, Doug. That's a lot of information, and I know we have a wide variety of folks on the call, so I know I look forward to going back and rewatching and pausing where I need to catch up. We've received a ton of questions. We will be following up with everyone on those via email shortly after the webinar and try and get back to you as soon as we can. We will address every one of them. But I think we have time probably just for maybe one question. One of the first ones that came in is can I use an SD card to store base maps for Collector on Android?
It's a great question. So yes, you can. So you can, obviously many Android devices, they expect you to, they don't have a lot of internal memory. They do require a use of an SD card. So one of the great techniques that we've seen is people who, if you do have devices that do support SD cards, of just sideloading those and putting those base maps on those SD cards, just having them ready for people to walk in and grab one and walk out the door. That's really been a very effective way. It's something that certainly is unique to the Android platform, but that is something that you certainly can take advantage of.
All right, thank you. I think that'll be really helpful. Note that these resources will be emailed as well as our contact information. And then I also wanted to remind everyone that there is a follow-up survey that will pop up on your screen as soon as we close out the call. And if you hadn't heard, the Esri User Conference this year will be a virtual event. So as long as the agency that you work for is current on its maintenance and is up to date, then you can register. So here's the link. That link will also be included in the follow-up email. And we will hold on the next wildfire webinar. Won't take place until after the user conference. During the user conference, there's going to be a ton of really useful sessions on mobile apps, on field deployment, on things that are relevant. If you need any help picking some of those out, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And I would like to thank all of you again for joining us for this wildfire webinar. We hope you found it useful and informative, and have a nice day.